Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Kenza Bouhaj. I'm a fellow at GSV Ventures, and I'm also pursuing my MBA at Harvard Business School. If you are here today, you're at least curious and hopefully a believer in Africa's huge potential in becoming the next big thing. In Africa's diverse 54 countries, one story is consistent. Education is a crucial vehicle for economic mobility, and technology has this power to improve both access and quality of education. Today, I'm joined by the unsung heroes of the African EdTech story, the people who are building the EdTech ecosystem, investing in and supporting African entrepreneurs on their quest to solve Africa's biggest education problems. So I'm very happy to have today AbdulKarim Mohamed from Acumen, Julia Moffett from the Future of Learning Fund, Theodore Sutherland, who works as an independent ecosystem builder, and Sam Mugacha from Imaginable Futures. So thank you for being here with us today. I want us to start the conversation by anchoring on this African EdTech opportunity and understanding the challenges in EdTech in Africa. So let me start with this question. Has Africa's EdTech finally come? Why now? So maybe we start with you, Abdul.
Sure. Pleasure to be here, and thanks for everybody for showing interest. When I think about answering this question, my mind goes, so I describe myself as a recovering engineer. So data sort of is often sticks in my mind. So part of that, I'll give you guys some what I think are leading indicators to show that sort of now is the time for African EdTech. The first is African parents and children have a thirst for paying for education. So typically GDP per capita expenditure in education is about 25% across sub-Saharan Africa. In more developed markets like the US and Europe, it's less than 5%. Point number two, huge potential in terms of number of students. Over the next 18 years, Africa is going to add 700 million people. That's double the US population, and the median age is going to be 19 years old. The next one I will say is I speak often to peers or investors in the Indian EdTech ecosystem, and they typically say that African EdTech is about 7 years behind India, and I'll come back to that 7-year number. The other leading indicator is the huge growth in venture capital across sub-Saharan Africa. Last year, ventures raised about $4 billion, up from $1 to $1.5 billion previously. India had that same jump in 2013, 7 years ago. You look at the number of African unicorns, billion-dollar startups across the continent. Depending on how you categorize that, there's anywhere between 7 to 10. The number of edtechs on that list is between 15 to 20%. But education entrepreneurs only attract less than 5% of the capital. All of these, to me, are leading indicators that I think now is the time for edtech in Africa, and there's an abundance of potential.
Thank you. Julia?
Is it on? Okay, great. Thank you, Kenza. Nice to be here, and congratulations on getting so many Africa-focused panels at GSV this year. I think that's an answer to your question in many ways. I'm just going to add to Abdul's great list. COVID, like everything, accelerated the future of learning by 10 years, or I think that's the Michael Moe, you would know, GSV number that you guys use. 70% of African governments have introduced new online learning policies as a result of COVID, but I would say there's another dimension that's as important, if not more, which is mindset change in very conservative societies around traditional education systems. I think that's accelerated a new way of thinking about learning by decades, quite serious. Tech infrastructure, look at the maps of the fiber cables going around the continent being laid by Google and Facebook. I think there was a $400 million cable between Asia and Africa just yesterday. And I read a statistic the other day, I think from the ITU, that says in Nigeria and Ghana, average monthly data cost household is down to 2% of your household spend, which is kind of affordable. Founder quality, look in the room. Bola, others here. So second, third time founders, that's obviously the makings of a vibrant tech ecosystem, and it's very real. And finally, somebody else here in the room has coined the term global talent grid. So that's going to open up a new way of thinking about the ed tech opportunity in Africa in a big way, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Hey everyone. I'm going to pick on, I think, Abdul's point and maybe bring a more qualitative view. I think the last 10 years has really been a pivotal shift in the Africa EdTech space, or education space in general, where you've had a few model players be able to build institutions on the continent. You think of places like Nova Pioneer, Fred Swanica building up the African Leadership Group. You're having a different profile of corporate or professional people who could have done other things choose to focus on education. I think that has started creating a traction of talent and resources more and more coming into education. And I think the last 2 years, especially as happened in other markets in the world, really accelerated more builders recognizing that actually there's great opportunity both for impact, but also for return. I think that there is a caveat there, in my opinion. I think the landscape, and this is very much a blanket statement, I think the landscape has roughly two very extreme profiles of people who are choosing to build now. I think there are people on one hand who are coming from very much an education lens. They want to drive learning outcomes. They want to see the students do better. They develop great education products, but I don't find that they have very good commercial sense necessarily. So building great businesses is not necessarily a strength that they naturally have to the table. The other extreme of people entering the space are folks who are coming from a more corporate background. They might have been founders before, they might have come straight from corporate or some proxy where I think they actually speak the language of VCs very well. And so they tend to be building companies that I think, in my opinion, drive a lot of metrics that look good on the surface, but when you start getting into the actual learning outcomes and if that's actually changing learning on the continent, I don't think that you're actually seeing very true change necessarily. My position is that I think over the next 5 or so years, you are going to see a merger of that profile. I think both of those players need to exist in the ecosystem. And you're going to start seeing more of a middle ground where the people on the left are learning more from the people on the right, perhaps merging some of these companies. Some of them will fail. But I think the ecosystem overall will learn significantly and position us to then be able to build businesses that can truly scale and drive impact, meaningful impact on the continent. So that's where I think we are as an ecosystem right now.
From my perspective, I want to build on Julia's point. I think this aspect of mindset shift is something that really started taking place during the onset of COVID. So as the kids went home, I think the entire ecosystem, the stakeholders really realized like we need to keep the students engaged, and it stopped being about a competition. All of a sudden, the teacher is not thinking that EdTech is going to come and disrupt my job and throw me out of a job. She wants to come and collaborate and use this as a tool to be able to continuously provide learning to the kids. The government is not all of a sudden pushing the door and closing the door at EdTech companies. It was now saying like, oh, wait, hold up a minute. There was this person who was at my door knocking and saying about a solution that can actually reach people at home. And now when the parent comes in terms of the mindset, and here is where I feel like there actually needs to be some additional work, it's the parent all of a sudden does not see the mobile device as only this communication tool. It becomes the ultimate convergence in terms of there's so much this tool can be able to do for it to be able to facilitate learning. And I think even as we are talking about the space being really primed and being really at this stage where it's ready for a lot of innovation and acceptance, I think there's still a bit that needs to be, there's still ways to go in terms of setting up the infrastructure with basic things like electricity for us to actually begin to see that critical mass of people begin to adopt EdTech and be able to build sustainable businesses across it.
Great. So it is clear that the market opportunity is there, and it's very important to start planting the seeds now so that the landscape can flourish in the future. So I'll stay with you, Sam, and zooming in a little bit into EdTech. Which subsectors are you most excited about on the continent, and why?
I think one subsector that really excites me on EdTech is higher ed and credentialing. And the reason for this is when you look at, and this came up in the last panel, like if you look at the capacity in terms of higher ed institutions and the rate at which the youth dividend is growing in Africa, that capacity does not meet. And when you look at how jobs are being created and the rate of change of jobs is happening in the world and on the continent, it's a very high rate. So what excites me about some of the opportunities that we are beginning to see is just-in-time training and solutions that are coming to actually meet the learner where they are, provide solutions on micro-credentialing that can be able to sort of bridge that gap for people who just want that short course to be able to upskill or reskill so that they can be able to apply their skills to the job market.
Great. Theo?
It's a difficult question. I'm going to caveat it slightly. I think my personal interest in education is, as probably a few people in this room as well, I think there's a need to rethink the purpose of education beyond the current benchmarks of what is defined as success. Somebody spoke earlier on a panel about the colonial version of education that we have adopted, and I think we can talk about, how do we get better at meeting those expectations. I'm personally interested in completely transforming what that looks like. I think we are ways away from that, though, to become a mass market solution necessarily. I think what I am interested in seeing and excited about in the ecosystem is some of the building blocks that can enable that possibility. One that I think is really interesting is this influx of people starting to really focus on how education can help match to employment. There's a lot of focus on the training side. I haven't personally seen anybody yet who's necessarily cracked the placement at scale, but I think that that's a place that's attracting a lot of money and attention, whether it's from governments, foundations, just builders wanting to be in that space and entrepreneurs. So I think getting enough smart people and resources will help us figure that problem out, and we do need to figure it out for our nations and our continent more broadly. So I'm excited to see what businesses will eventually be built from that and solutions that I think will come in the next few years. I think the second thing that's personally interesting to me, it's a very boring business, but I think a very necessary one, is just building the infrastructure that reduces the administration for schools to deliver learning and for workplaces to onboard, manage their talent. So much of our energy right now, in building those schools and businesses on the continent is just spent with so much admin that takes away from thinking more strategically about the talents that we're actually developing as students or in our staff. And I think that's going to free up a lot more human capital on the continent to do more strategic thinking, I think, over the next few years. So I'm excited for that reason of what's being enabled.
Julia?
I'm excited about everything. So I'm really an annoying person to answer this question. Just a few observations about some subsectors, and then I'll talk about the one I'm really interested in. But I think let's take note of just huge gaps and wide open spaces. So we've made 2 investments, one in a digital children's digital broadcast channel, as has Abdul, who's actually led the round in Kenya, first of its kind on the continent, launches a year later, 10 million viewers per week. And that's going to be replicated in every other market it goes into because of an absence of high-quality children's educational content. We've also invested in, and you may have as well, an online higher education marketplace called Cradle. It's an Apply Board, Cialfo, these other markets. So let's just take note of things that are arriving that are just filling spaces, number one. Number two, I'm not as interested in it as an investor, but we should take note that 70% of Kenyans, South Africans, and Nigerians pay for out-of-school tutoring services in an analog world, so that will mirror the tutoring businesses as we've seen in global EdTech. And thirdly, just to take note of, and I'm still learning about it as we all are, but the power of these new online high schools. And of course, there's a lot of attention here at the conference being paid towards that. I think that's really interesting. For me personally, post-secondary skills-based learning, so learn to earn, alternative pathways, super interesting. I think the $180 billion digital skills market is super layered and textured, down from data analysts and labelers on the one side to what OPE is doing with Kibo, et cetera, and everything in between. I think one of the more interesting ones that just that prompts our thinking. Whether it's going to be successful, I don't know. It's Moringa School out of Nairobi. They're taking the Flatiron curriculum at $15,000, reteaching it to Kenyan teachers who are offering it for $1,500. So I think that's going to get super interesting. Transformation of higher ed, Fadl's here with Nexford University, just challenger universities. But I also think there's a big question about, what's the Nike of Africa going to be? Nike. And so, what does that mean for global online higher ed coming onto the continent? I don't think we know. And then finally, to Theodore's point, I think some people are a little bit dismissive about the roles that employers are going to play in education for pre-skilling and upskilling, but I'm really bullish on that, and I think that we're starting to see indications that that's going to be more vibrant than some people like to say, that the employers are not big enough, so you don't have a guild education, but I think you'll have a lot of other things.
On my end, maybe similar to Julia, I wanted to answer this question and say I'm most excited about product development across all categories. And I say that mostly in my role. Acumen launched a $10 million K-12 fund 2.5 years ago. So I see some really cool products every day. And to Sam's point, a product does not make a business. We'll come back to that later. But I'm just excited about the innovative ideas. And I'll give you one example. There's one Kenyan EdTech company that we've been trying to support for the last year, and they have this really cool assessment technology that can be quite predictive in terms of understanding where a child is going in terms of the learning journey. And in that space of being able to provide individualized learning support. If you go to the closest school to this conference here in San Diego, I'm sure you walk into any classroom, there's going to be disparities in terms of learning levels that the students are at. This company took their algorithm and partnered with an international NGO, and we're supporting a couple of thousand children in refugee camps. These are children that have been displaced from conflict, climate change, have been out of school for multiple years, and they were able to fine-tune their algorithm to be able to provide individual support in that context. And I think about the power of that technology and how valuable it could be globally. So to me, the personalized learning, I think, is the one space that I do see some really cool products coming out. And again, a product does not make a company, but we'll come back to that after.
Great. Well, to Julia's point, I think I'm also excited about everything. And before I forget, huge shout out to Kibo. So Ope is going to be pitching at the GSV Cup on Stage X this afternoon. So make sure to be there to support her, and hopefully she makes it to the top 3 tomorrow. I want to ask a question to Abdul and Julia. So I'll go to you first, Abdul. You mentioned a lot of challenges that African EdTech entrepreneurs have to face. But the bright side of that story is that turns business model into innovative, that turns the companies into innovative products and innovative business models. Can you give us some examples of innovative business models that you've seen to respond to challenges?
Yeah, I think for me, so back to that point in terms of really cool products, the challenge in turning them into sustainable business models, there's this really cool article that DFC Lab issued a few years ago that talks about sort of the value at the base of the pyramid in Africa. And what they did is they looked at, in most African countries, what percentage of the population makes more than $10 a day. Kenya is a country of 50 million people. There's just over 1.2 million people that earn $10 a day. In comparison, in India, there's 40 million, China, 600 million. So put yourself in the shoes of a Kenyan EdTech entrepreneur, right? The market of people who make more than $10 a day is quite small. So you really have to design your product for people who earn between $4 and $8 a day. And just imagine what that does to the pressures of your costs, your margins, customer acquisition cost. So I think a lot of the entrepreneurs are fighting through these challenges and figuring out how to sell to schools, how to sell to parents. And again, I've seen these products. These are really great products, but poverty is still a real thing. And when I say $4 to $8 a day, that's an annual salary of $1,500 US. So imagine you're trying to build a product to cater to a market that makes $1,500. So I think entrepreneurs, and there's the panel that's coming on at 3 after this, I think the entrepreneurs have done creative things in figuring out how to package their products and how to convey that value directly to consumers, but also to schools as well.
Julia?
I guess I would say 2 things. One is we just can't underestimate, as many or most people in the room know, this is a mobile-first continent. So when you start looking at products just the mobile aspect of, Zeraki, which you're investing in, is part of its success is it's a learning management system that's mobile. So I think that's a big differentiator. I would just say as an example of something that I get excited about, if you look again in sort of a lower economic swaths of the societies, you have a largely informal economies, and you have an inability to pay school fees in what is 1 out of every 4 children on the continent is now in a low-cost private school because the capacity of the public schools are too overloaded to accept policy changes even when it increases access. So you've got people flocking into low-cost private schools and they can't pay the school fees. And this leads to, and they can't pay them because they're in an informal economy so that the big payments at the beginning of the term don't work. That leads to children being pulled out of school, moved to others. It leads to teachers not being paid and therefore being absent, et cetera, et cetera. They go out into the market for credit. It's a mess. And it's exploitative, et cetera, even though there's a lot of innovation in it. You also then talk to the proprietors of these low-cost private schools. They're spending 70% of their time collecting school fees. Only 50% of that is successful. So I've seen a company, as we all are looking at, coming out of East Africa, that's really trying to smooth out payments, alternative credit scoring. So you're seeing a lot of mashup of fintech and edtech together, and it's doing it in a B2B to C model. So it's going in and loaning to the school operator, who then on loans and runs these alternative credit processes for short loans of 120 days at 5%. Makes all the difference in the world.
Great. Switching gears a little bit, there's a lot of global edtech companies in their quest for growth who are looking to enter the African continent and have all sorts of questions about how to do that. What is your advice to these companies looking to enter the market? And maybe, Sam, I can ask you that.
I don't think that's a problem with anyone in this room. I think number one is Africa is not homogeneous. It's not one country. It's a continent made of very many countries, different cultures, different purchasing power ability, and different attitudes. The second thing I would say is one thing that I really get excited about, especially when it comes to cross-learning and cross-sharing across global, is this aspect of, there are some entrepreneurs who've coined, it's called glocal, globally informed, locally relevant. That there are lessons that you can get from the international market, but you need to localize. You need to see and partner with local people to understand the local context and to understand what are the unique challenges that actually need to be addressed. And the other thing I would just reinforce is authentic partnerships. Authentic partnerships for me means it's not something that, it's how do we collaborate, work together to actually address this challenge. It's not, you're not my competitor, I'm not above you, is how can I come in and actually collaborate with you to be able to make things much more efficient and much more successful.
Theo, do you have a view?
I think maybe I agree with the point you mentioned. I think I'll practicalize them slightly. So I think the first thing that I see with companies looking to enter Africa, first is how they think about pricing. Second is how they think about product. Third is how they think about distribution. Pricing. The continent, I think, has been shared on several occasions, doesn't have the same ability to pay as some of the other markets that people might be playing in. A lot of these extrapolations, you hear somebody say, the US, the MBA program or whatever is like $20,000, so we're making it $2,000. It's like, well, does that necessarily mean that this market can afford $2,000? Like, whatever they pay in the US is completely irrelevant. Like, that's not. Anyway, you get the point. I think similarly around pricing is even how you think about the payments of the pricing, right? So one of the things that I always get excited about when I see entrepreneurs in their deck talk about like your top 3 value propositions, and one of them is like the ability to pay monthly, for example. I was like, you get the markets. Like you understand because you're matching your pricing to how people get paid, right? So does the school collect money on a monthly basis, on a semester basis? So really thinking about like how do your consumers get paid and how does that impact the way they pay you in that pricing brackets. The second is around product. A lot of people come in with very beautiful, interactive video, high definition content. It's like, that's so great. I'm sure it works really well if I was in Boston or if I was in London. But like my data costs are so high, so your product doesn't actually translate for the markets you're trying to tackle. And I think there's a lot of product. My personal take is actually that we're going to see a lot of product innovation from very resource-constrained markets, because if you have to deliver in a modular format, you have to deliver value very early. Otherwise, the customer is not willing to pay for the next day or for the next month, as opposed to if I'm paying you, for a longer period of time. So I think you're going to see actually quite a bit of product innovation, because companies that are practicing and building on the continent literally have to be thinking about like, your client is thinking about like, tomorrow, should I still be paying for this service? And that's a very different relationship to have with the customer and with them to have with their products. The distribution, I think, is also very interesting, because I've been speaking to a few people who are thinking about what you probably heard of, OPM businesses, helping universities take their programs online. And it's so interesting, as they're talking about their business models, because one of the toughest things to do on the continent is to find the right customers. Like, just customer acquisition is a huge challenge for many of us. And the natural places to find distribution are not obvious to a Western customer. You mentioned earlier about telcos. Dude, like, telcos aggregates the entire markets. And so just really understanding, like, where am I going through for distribution so I can actually acquire customers at a sensible cost and find the right customers is such a big difference in those markets. I use telcos as just one example. Nobody's really trying to go to Verizon to try and partner in the US, for example. So I think those are three very tactical ways that people entering the continent should be thinking differently about their business models.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not to be all protectionist. I think made in Africa is important. If we can't do that, made with Africans should be an order priority for global edtech companies. So let's talk a little bit about your day-to-day jobs and the role that you guys play as ecosystem builders. And my question is, how can the African EdTech ecosystem be strengthened today? What kind of gaps exist today in the system? Maybe I could start with you.
I think the one thing that would be most beneficial is more market-based research. And before I define that, I'll share a quick story. This is about 2 years ago. Popped up on my LinkedIn page. Somebody was like, just completed PhD level research, and it was somewhere in Southern Africa. If you give girls bikes, attendance in education goes up. I'm not the smartest person in every room, but to me, I feel like that was an ill use of research funds. I think, and this is what I mean, I think in the challenges, again, I see many pitch decks. Entrepreneurs have creative ideas. The challenge they have is creating that sort of MVP in terms of, connecting it to sort of demand. And there needs to be more research in terms of what parents, schools, teachers, what their pain points are, what they'd be willing to pay for these products, so the entrepreneurs can match supply and demand. And I think there's a lot of research that happens in education, and I hope there's no academia folks in the crowd there to come after me, but it's wonderful that you've done research on the efficacy if you give a child a tablet, that their knowledge, numeracy and literacy goes up. What I think the ecosystem really needs is, how do you build a sustainable business model so that you don't need development and aid coming in, dropping off a tablet? So I think there needs to be more market-based research to help the entrepreneurs. And I'll give you another anecdote. You look at two companies, Spotify and Netflix. Just take a look at the struggles that they are having in emerging markets, not just Africa, also in India. These are huge billion-dollar companies with huge balance sheets. 2 months ago in India, Netflix cut their monthly subscription price by 60%. This is a market with cheapest devices, the cheapest mobile data, 1.5 billion people, and they cut their price by 60%. And part of it is they're trying to figure out how you convince a consumer in an emerging market to purchase their product. EdTech entrepreneurs in Africa are struggling with the same thing. There needs to be more market-based research to help them connect the dots.
Julia?
Sorry, ecosystem question?
What gaps exist in the ecosystem?
So I'm with Abdul. I'm sure we're all going to say on the data and market-based research without question. I don't want to cast aspersions, but you look at this report that everybody, which was a great report that everybody quotes, the $18 billion market opportunity, and you read through it, half of everything in that report is now out of date. The companies don't exist, et cetera, et cetera. So some ability for more dynamic research and insights, I think, would be unbelievable, and I hope we can all contribute to them. Secondly, I would say, sort of going back to mindset, if you're talking sort of broad ecosystem, I think anything that can be done to help accelerate a new conversation around the public-private debate is going to be very useful. I think that people get tripped up in it constantly. There are all these no-go zones, and I just feel like, without sounding overly simplistic about it, those days have got to be over of that sort of black and white debate. I think that governments need to realize that what's represented in GSV and in the EdTech ecosystem is not a nice to have or mavericks on the margins. It's now a requirement for scale and effective learning. You cannot build brick and mortar education fast enough on this continent to meet the demand, and public systems can't transform fast enough in order to be agile enough for market-based skills. And that's true in Cincinnati, Ohio, and it's true in Nairobi, Kenya. And I just think that the sooner governments can be encouraged and incentivized to get into a different kind of a conversation, it'll be unbelievable for the ecosystem. And then I think the final thing I would just say is, I think we talk a lot about learning engineering and learning science, but I think it's a bit of a black box to a lot of the entrepreneur community. And so I think things that can sort of demystify that and actionalize that into products and services will be super interesting.
Theo? What are some of the gaps that exist today in the ecosystem, and how do we fill them?
Okay. I think one would be very direct collaboration between investors in Africa. Right now, in my opinion, there's a big binary between, like, you're either doing impact investing, philanthropic money, or VC money. And quite frankly, the ecosystem is way too small for people to be playing in silos, because so much of what's happening, to the point about market research, I think that could be incredibly valuable, but actually getting like just real-time insights from you listen in Nigeria, you guys are actually trying to figure this thing out, like, what do your numbers look like? Like, the ability to understand what actual businesses operating on the continent are seeing from customer behavior is probably the most valuable data that any of us could have, which could help shape the ecosystem, like you said, both for investors' expectations, but also for builders to be able to have better insights about where should they be focusing their efforts and what kind of balls actually to consider dropping, or new experiments that could be launched. So I think more collaboration across the different types of capital would be hugely valuable for all players. I think the second thing for me is collaboration on technical skills to support the ecosystem. You probably remember I said earlier the two extremes of entrepreneurs I've seen on the continents, folks who are very deep in product, folks who are very deep on the commercial. I think part of what's missing is a few core skill sets, like learning experience design, like as a skill set, can be a very expensive thing for any one company to get. But imagine if a few investors came together to pool a pool of funds to say, we're actually going to sponsor almost like a mini venture studio. And there are certain competencies that we can bring into that studio that companies in their portfolio could tap into and share the costs within effectively to help them truly create great businesses that are also very viable on a product outcome. I think could be both very innovative as pushing the boundary of what collaboration looks like in ways, again, that are very practically important for all players in the ecosystem. So that, for me, is what the ecosystem could move towards, and something that I know we're actively talking about piloting as well.
Sign me up.
I think these points were brilliant. What I would just add, especially on the collaboration piece, is I feel, and this is my opinion, that a lot of the EdTech market is also fragmented, especially from an operator side, where the silos is not only on the funders, but it also appears like this competition for funding, that it's either me or you, and this avoids collaboration. amongst EdTech players. And if we can collaborate, some of these challenges cut across everyone, whether it's infrastructure challenges, whether it's challenges on data. If we can collaborate and share, I feel like there's ways we can go. And then the other one in terms of product, and I think, Theo, you had mentioned this, and it also came from Abdul, I think there's also this aspect of quality that I think we need to also work on in terms of how do we ensure that we are building tools that are leveraged on the science of learning, that are telling us if this is the way a child comprehends or absorbs knowledge, then this is how these tools need to be created. And this is how they need to be supported so that they can be able to retain and absorb that knowledge. So I think these are some of the hurdles that I feel in terms of quality that we can overcome and that we can work towards so that we can actually bring the EdTech system to a greater sense of health.
Thank you. My last question is, in your capacity as investors, what are your top 3 asks for the international EdTech community to help support the African EdTech ecosystem? You know, a lot of people are watching us from home. A lot of people are here, curious about Africa, willing to invest in Africa. So what would be your top 3 asks? And I'll start with you, Abdul.
Maybe number 1 is open up your checkbooks. I'm happy to point you to really cool, innovative companies and products. I think, and many of us on this panel probably get this a lot, people will reach out that are curious. I think there needs to be this conversion from curiosity to action. And I'm not dictating what type of action that is, but whether it be funding market-based research, whether it be angel investing, I think money does drive and move the ecosystem. You look at what's happened in the off-grid energy space. In the span of 7-8 years, funding went from 40 million to nearly $2 billion. And the net result of that is a country like Kenya went from 40% electrification to 80%. TV ownership went from 10% to 60%. We invested in a kids' television channel last year. This happens because money into infrastructure. The next thing I would say is similar to the point the gentleman made. I think when you look at entrepreneurs in other ecosystems, whether it's India, the US, other parts of Asia, I think the lessons they've learned and the pitfalls they've had as EdTech entrepreneurs, those are lessons that the African EdTech entrepreneurs could tremendously benefit from. There's no point in having 100 EdTech entrepreneurs fall into the same hole, right? And I think part of this is similar to what Sam has said. I just don't think there's anybody whose mandate it is to sort of collect some of these insights and present them in a way so that an entrepreneur who wakes up today and says, oh, I'm passionate and I want to create an education startup, there should be resources they could go to and say, these are 15 things you should not do with your limited resources, and what you'll end up as an ecosystem with 15 new ways and different trials that have worked or maybe not worked, and that just moves the ecosystem forward. So open up your checkbooks and share insights from other ecosystems. So there are 2 things I would say.
I checked this with SEC guidelines before the panel, as well as our lawyers. We're raising a $20 million early stage EdTech fund for Africa. Everybody's welcome to be part of it. Thank you, Bola. But we would really welcome it. But that's really to address, there's a pre-seed and seed gap for these founders, and there's going to be for a long time. There's a heck of a lot of Series A interest from all the blue chip, wonderful EdTech funds represented at this conference. But having a local dedicated EdTech fund is going to be exciting, I hope, and we would welcome investors. Secondly, and I get to say this as the only non-African on the panel who's had the privilege of working and living in East Africa for 8 years, look for places where there are non-expat founders. I think an international community very easily falls into Nairobi, very easily falls into Cape Town. But you're going to find a lot of international founders, great businesses, but try spending time in Lagos and seeing what that deal flow looks like. It's super, super exciting and bigger. And the final one is that I'm seeing through the work of all the wonderful founders we're getting to look at businesses of, that there is just an absence of finance solution for student finance. So you're creating unbelievable businesses, and everybody goes, oh, is there an ISA product? Well, there isn't that's going to work. And so I think it's a really big open space that if somebody can come in or actors can come in and start figuring out solutions is going to drive an ecosystem very quickly, because right now people are creating businesses that you should be able to get very good, affordable financing for as a student, and you can't.
So I think two asks. The first is, I'm personally feeling very convicted about the opportunity for a VC fund and a venture studio on the continent. So I'm excited about the work that Julia and the team are doing, but I think we need more builders in that ecosystem and people who have at least been builders before, helping to support some of the entrepreneurs in the ecosystem. And so if that's something you're interested in, I'm happy to chat more about a venture studio on the continent. I think the second thing that is also pressing is the opportunity, like I was describing earlier, to have very tangible collaboration opportunities. I think the market research piece is something that I'm also really keenly interested in. And so Abdul and I are open to chatting with people who would like to explore that further.
Money. And I think the second thing is really having an eye on equity. We don't want to bring forth EdTech, and then all it does is perpetuate some of the inequities that already exist within the continent. So really coming in with an eye on how can this really support and not perpetuate some of the inequities that we already have on the continent, where there's only a few who have access and have the ability to afford some of these products.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you for being here with us. To the audience, right after this, we have Abdul moderating the next panel on African entrepreneurs as well, EdTech entrepreneurs, so please stay behind if you're interested. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here, and